In the grim darkness of the far future, there are horrors beyond counting. Ancient weapons sleep beneath shattered worlds, waiting for the day they might wake again. But what happens when those who disturb these slumbering giants are not noble space marines seeking to reclaim their fallen brother, nor pious tech priests hoping to recover sacred technology? What happens when the ones who find a dreadnought that's been buried for 4,000 years are orcs? The answer is exactly what you'd expect from the galaxy's most enthusiastic looters, and yet somehow so much worse. Picture a dead world. Not dead in the sense of lifeless, sterile rock drifting through the void, but dead in the way that only war can kill. This planet once had a name, though that name has been lost to time along with everything else about its former inhabitants. The ruins that dot its surface tell stories in a language no living being can read anymore. Vast structures of corroded metal rise from plains of fused glass, their purposes forgotten, their creators turned to dust millennia ago. The atmosphere is thin but breathable, tainted with the chemical residue of weapons that were fired so long ago that the very forge worlds that produced them no longer exist. This is the kind of world that draws orc scavengers like flies to rotting meat. They arrive in ships that shouldn't fly according to any sane understanding of physics, held together by little more than rust, faith, and the gestalt psychic field that all greenskins generate. The orcs don't know the planet's history, and they wouldn't care if they did. All they see is endless scrap, mountains of it, just waiting to be hauled back to their ramshackle workshops and turned into vehicles, weapons, and other instruments of delightful violence. Warboss Grackett Ironjaw led this particular warband, a relatively small force by orc standards, perhaps a few hundred strong. They weren't part of any great wag, just an independent group of looters and scrappers looking to make their fortune in salvage and then maybe find someone to fight. Grackett himself was a typical specimen of orc leadership, standing nearly 3 meters tall, his massive frame augmented with crude bionics that whirred and clanked with every movement. He'd lost his original jaw to a space marine chainsword years ago, hence the iron replacement that gave him his name, and he wore it with the pride that orcs reserve for battle scars and successful lootings. The first few days on the dead world went exactly as expected. The boys spread out across the ruins, hauling back anything that looked even remotely useful. Chunks of ceramite plating that might have once been part of buildings or vehicles, twisted heaps of metal that could be beaten into new shapes, even fragments of what might have been weapons, though they were so corroded and ancient that it was impossible to say for certain. The mech boys, those orcs blessed with an innate understanding of technology that they couldn't explain even if they wanted to, examined everything with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for impending violence. It was Big Mech Throttle Grinder who made the discovery. He was working a grid in the northern wastes, an area where the ruins seemed to have been subjected to particularly intense bombardment at some point in the distant past. The ground here was different, compressed and compacted by forces that had turned soil and rock into something approaching solid stone. His scanner, a device he'd built from looted Imperial components and didn't fully understand, kept giving him strange readings. Something big was down there, buried deep, and it was made of materials that his scanner identified as valuable, very valuable. Throttle Grinder immediately called for diggers, orcs who specialized in excavation work, not because they enjoyed digging particularly, but because they enjoyed finding stuff to loot. They arrived with their crude excavation equipment, machines that were more about brute force than finesse, and set to work. The digging took days. Every meter they descended revealed more compacted debris from whatever cataclysm had buried this thing. Fragments of buildings, fused metal, the occasional skeletal remains of warriors from forgotten armies. And then, at a depth of nearly 20 meters, they hit something that their equipment couldn't penetrate. Something solid, something massive. The orcs cleared away the debris by hand, an activity that would have seemed like tedious labor to any other species, but which the Orks approached with growing excitement. What they revealed made even battle-hardened greenskins pause in something approaching awe. It was a dreadnought, an Imperial dreadnought of ancient pattern, its adamantium sarcophagus scarred by weapons fire, but fundamentally intact. The armor plating was covered in heraldry that had been worn almost smooth by time and trauma, but enough remained to identify it as belonging to the Iron Hammers chapter. A chapter that, if any of the Orks had access to Imperial records, they would have learned was destroyed nearly 4,000 years ago in a catastrophic engagement with a Chaos warband, their fortress monastery reduced to rubble, their gene seeds scattered to the solar winds. But the Orks didn't know any of this, and they wouldn't have cared if they did. All they saw was the most beautiful thing any Ork could hope to find. A big, stompy fighting machine, buried like treasure, just waiting for them to claim it. The fact that it was Imperial made it even better. Humi tech was always good for looting, and this was the biggest piece of Humi tech they'd found in years. To understand what happens next, you need to understand what a dreadnought really is. It's not simply a walking tank or a mechanized suit of armor. It's a tomb, a sarcophagus, and a weapon system all rolled into one horrible package. When a space marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even their enhanced biology cannot save them, but their mind remains intact, they are offered a choice. They can accept death with honor, their gene seed harvested for the next generation of warriors, or they can accept interment within a dreadnought chassis. The process is as much nightmare as salvation. The Marine's ruined body is removed from what remains of their power armor and placed within the armored sarcophagus at the heart of the dreadnought. Life support systems sustain the failing organs, while neural interfaces connect directly to the brain, allowing the pilot to see through the machine's sensors, fight with its weapons, and move with its massive limbs. The pain is constant, a dull ache that never fully fades, but it becomes background noise to the warrior encased in metal. But that's just the beginning of the horror. A dreadnought pilot doesn't stay awake continuously. The mental strain of interfacing with such a massive war machine is overwhelming, and the pilot's deteriorating biology cannot sustain consciousness indefinitely. When they're not needed for battle, they're placed into stasis sleep, a state of suspended animation where time becomes meaningless. They might sleep for years, decades, even centuries between awakenings, each time finding that the world they knew has changed, that their battle brothers have aged and died, that everything familiar has been worn away by the relentless march of time. The oldest dreadnoughts, the venerable ones, have been serving for thousands of years. They remember battles that have passed into legend, wars fought before the current Imperium even existed in its present form. They are living history, walking archives of tactics and experience, and they are deeply, profoundly alone in ways that no living being can truly comprehend. To be entombed in a dreadnought is to be granted a kind of immortality, yes, but it's an immortality bought at the price of everything that makes life worth living. This particular dreadnought, which the Orks would never know, had once been called Brother Ancient Cassian of the Iron Hammers, had been buried for 4,000 years. 4 millennia of darkness, of silence, of dreamless sleep, beneath tons of debris on a world whose name had been forgotten. His sarcophagus had sustained him through it all, its ancient systems designed to function for exactly this kind of extended dormancy. The adamantium shell had protected him from the crushing weight of the collapse that buried him, from the slow erosion of centuries, from everything except the passage of time itself. Inside that shell, what remained of Brother Ancient Cassian existed in a state of suspended consciousness, neither truly alive nor fully dead. His organic components, what few remained after his original wounding and subsequent millennia of slow decay, floated in amniotic fluid. His brain, still functional thanks to the life support systems, maintained a kind of minimal awareness, even in stasis. He did not dream. He did not think. He simply existed, waiting for an awakening that he had long since given up hoping would ever come. The Orks, of course, understood none of this. They saw a big metal fighting thing, and that was enough. Throttlegrinder examined it with the kind of enthusiasm that made other Orks nervous, poking at panels, trying to find access ports, testing the armor's strength with increasingly heavy hammers. The Dreadnought was inert, its systems in full shutdown, showing no more response to the mech's prodding than any other piece of salvage. That should have been the end of it. The Orks should have simply hauled the whole thing back to their ships, taken it apart piece by piece, and used the components to build something suitably Orky. That's what usually happened when they found Imperial technology. But Throttlegrinder was ambitious, and he had an idea that excited him more than simple salvage ever could. What if they could get the thing working? What if they could make it fight for them, at least long enough to see what it could do before they tore it apart? This is where we need to talk about Orks and their relationship with technology, because it's one of the most fascinating and misunderstood aspects of their species. There's a common belief that Ork technology only works because they believe it will work, that their gestalt psychic field literally bends reality to make their ramshackle weapons and vehicles function. This is both true and not true in ways that would give any tech priest a migraine. The reality is more nuanced. Ork mech boys possess an instinctive understanding of technology that's literally encoded in their genetic structure, a gift from the Old Ones who created their species millions of years ago as soldiers in a war that reshaped the galaxy. A mech boy doesn't learn how to build an engine or construct a weapon. He simply knows, the knowledge bubbling up from somewhere deep in his DNA. This means that Ork technology is actually functional on a basic mechanical level. A shooter fires bullets, not because Orks believe it fires bullets, but because it has a firing pin, a barrel, and a crude propellant system. However, and this is the critical part, Ork technology is so poorly constructed, so utterly lacking in any kind of quality control or proper engineering, that it shouldn't work as well as it does. Tolerances are way off. Components don't quite fit together properly. Safety mechanisms are non-existent. By all rights, an Ork weapon should explode in the user's hands more often than it successfully fires at the enemy. But it doesn't, and that's where the psychic field comes in. The Gestalt psychic energy generated by groups of Orks acts as a kind of quantum probability modifier, pushing unlikely outcomes toward more favorable ones. It doesn't create function where none exists, but it does make terrible engineering work better than it has any right to. This matters because it means that while Orks can't simply will Imperial technology to work, for them, they can jury-rig it, modify it, and generally abuse it in ways that would make any tech priest weep with horror. And the combination of their intuitive technical knowledge and their psychic field can actually make these horrible modifications function. This is how you get looted Lehman Russ tanks with mismatched armor plates and extra guns bolted on at random angles that somehow still manage to drive and fire. This is how Ork Def Dreads, crude knockoffs of Imperial Dreadnoughts, actually managed to stomp across battlefields, despite looking like they were assembled by blind grots in the dark. Throttlegrinder knew all of this instinctively, without being able to put it into words. He knew that the big metal fighting thing buried in the ground was Humitech, which meant it was probably overcomplicated and full of unnecessary bits. But he also knew that Humitech was generally well made even if it was designed all wrong. If he could just figure out how to turn it on, maybe bypass some of the Humi security stuff, he might be able to make it work. And wouldn't that be a laugh, having a Humi fighting machine working for the boys? The problem was access. The Dreadnought's exterior was solid adamantium, designed to withstand the kind of punishment that would vaporize lesser vehicles. Throttlegrinder tried cutting through it with his plasma torch, but the beam barely scratched the surface. He tried drilling, but his drill bits shattered against the armor. He even tried having some of the bigger boys hit it with power claws, but all they managed to do was leave some shallow gouges that would buff right out. It was a younger mech, one called Sparkplug, who noticed the access panel. It was hidden under layers of debris and corrosion, barely visible even when you knew what to look for, but it was there. Imperial dreadnoughts had maintenance hatches that tech marines used for field repairs and system checks. They were heavily armored themselves, but they were designed to be opened, eventually, with the right tools and the right knowledge. The Orks had neither the right tools nor the right knowledge, but they had hammers, pry bars, and an abundance of enthusiasm. It took them 6 hours of sustained effort to crack the access panel, breaking 3 different sets of tools in the process. But eventually, they managed to get it open. What they found inside was a maze of cables, conduits and systems that even Throttle Grinder's intuitive knowledge couldn't fully pass. This was technology from the Dark Age, preserved and maintained across millennia, and it was beautiful in a way that made the mech's fingers itch. He started pulling cables, testing connections, trying to trace power flows through systems he didn't fully understand. Other mechs gathered around, offering suggestions that mostly involved hitting things or cutting things or painting things red to make them go faster. Throttle Grinder ignored most of them, following his instincts, letting his genetically encoded knowledge guide his hands. And then, purely by accident, he connected 2 power relays that should never have been connected while the main power core was active. There was a flash of light, a surge of energy through systems that hadn't been energized in 4,000 years, and suddenly the dreadnought began to wake up. The change was subtle at first, a low hum, barely audible over the constant background noise of orcs arguing and machinery clanking. Then the hum grew louder, joined by other sounds. The whir of gyros initializing, the hiss of hydraulic systems pressurizing, the click and clack of targeting systems running through diagnostic checks. Status lights that had been dark for 40 centuries began to glow with soft amber and red illumination. Inside the sarcophagus, Brother Ancient Cassian's consciousness began the long, agonizing journey back from the depths of stasis sleep. It was like drowning in reverse, being pulled up from darkness into light, and every second of it was torture. His nervous system, such as it remained, lit up with signals that his brain struggled to interpret. He couldn't feel his body because he barely had a body anymore, just remnants suspended in fluid. But he could feel the machine around him, and that was almost worse. The neural interface activated, flooding his mind with data. He tried to process it, tried to understand what he was sensing, but it all felt wrong. The data was corrupted, filled with errors and warnings he'd never seen before. His chronometer, if it could be trusted, told him that he'd been in stasis for 4,117 years. That couldn't be right. That was impossible. The last thing he remembered was the battle on Targus III, the fortress monastery coming down around them, the crushing weight of billions of tons of ferrocrete and adamantium. He'd given the order for his brothers to evacuate, had stayed behind to buy them time, and then nothing. Just darkness and silence, and the eternal now of stasis sleep. But if the chronometer was accurate, if he'd really been asleep for more than 4 millennia, then everything he'd known was gone. His chapter, his brothers, the very Imperium he'd sworn to defend might have changed beyond recognition. The thought was too large, too terrible to fully process, so his combat-trained mind did what it had always done when faced with overwhelming emotion. It shut it down and focused on the immediate tactical situation. He tried to access his sensor suite, and that was when he realized something was very, very wrong. His systems were active, but they shouldn't be. Someone or something had bypassed his security protocols, had forced his power core online, had initiated his awakening sequence without proper authorization codes. That meant either tech priests who were doing emergency field repairs, or enemies who had somehow captured him intact. His optical sensors came online, and Brother Ancient Cassian saw greenskins. Dozens of them, all around his position, their faces animated with excitement and curiosity. Orks. He'd been found by Orks. After 4,000 years of darkness, the universe had decided to wake him up, and immediately present him with Xenos filth to purge. Some days, the Emperor's will was refreshingly straightforward. He tried to move, to activate his weapon systems, to do anything, but his motor controls were sluggish, unresponsive. 4 millennia of inactivity had degraded connections, fouled lubricants, and left his systems in dire need of maintenance. He could feel the Dreadnought chassis around him, could sense every plate of armor and every weapon mount, but making them respond to his commands was like trying to swim through molasses. The Orks noticed the changes immediately. The lights, the sounds, the way the Dreadnought's optical sensors began to glow with active illumination. They stopped what they were doing and stared at it, and for a moment, there was actually silence among the gathered greenskins. It was Throttle Grinder who broke that silence, his voice booming with excitement and triumph. "The big stompy thing's waking up, boys. Get ready to scrap if it gets Orna." The other Orks immediately scattered, grabbing weapons, taking cover behind debris, preparing for violence with the kind of efficiency that came from a lifetime of practice. Some of them were clearly excited, hoping for a good fight. Others looked nervous, which was unusual for Orks, but not unheard of when confronting unknown technology that might explode, or worse. Brother Ancient Cassian continued his slow awakening, forcing his systems to respond through sheer will. His weapons began to initialize, ancient mechanisms designed for one purpose, to deliver the Emperor's wrath to his enemies. His assault cannon, its barrels corroded but still functional, began to spin up with a sound like grinding metal. His power fist, massive enough to crush a tank, started to charge its energy field, electricity arcing across its surface. Through his external vox speakers, he attempted to speak, to demand identification and surrender from the Xenos, but what emerged was nothing like human speech. 4,000 years of disuse had degraded his vocal synthesizers, turning his words into a distorted mechanical screech that made the Orks flinch and cover their ears. He tried again, forcing his systems to comply, and this time managed something recognizable as Low Gothic, though it sounded like it was being spoken by a machine that was simultaneously dying and being born. "Xenos, filth, you have awakened, a warrior of the Emperor. Flee now, or face annihilation." The Orks, of course, didn't flee. That's not what Orks do, especially not when confronted with something that threatens them. Instead, they laughed. They pointed at the Dreadnought and laughed, because from their perspective, here was a Hume fighting machine that had been buried for who knows how long, probably half broken, definitely outnumbered, trying to threaten them. It was funny. It was hilarious. And if it wanted a fight, well, they were happy to oblige. Warboss Grackett stepped forward, his massive power claw crackling with energy, his iron jaw splitting into what might have been a grin. "Oi, you're on our turf now, Hume. That makes you our loot. You can come quiet like, or we can smash you to bits and loot you anyway. Your choice." Brother Ancient Cassian's response was to fire his assault cannon directly at the warboss. The weapon roared to life, spitting high-velocity shells in a deadly stream, and for a moment, it seemed like the ancient warrior would win before the fight even began. But his targeting systems were off, degraded by millennia of inactivity, and the shells went wide, tearing into the ground and sending up sprays of pulverized stone, but failing to hit any of the scattered Orks. The greenskins responded with their own weapons fire, a cacophony of shooters, sluggers, and rockets that filled the air with lead and explosives. Most of the shots bounced harmlessly off the Dreadnought's adamantium armor, doing little more than adding fresh scars to the ancient plating. But some found weak points, targeting the joints and exposed mechanisms that even the best Dreadnought design couldn't fully protect. Warning lights flared across Cassian's tactical display as minor systems took damage. He tried to move, to advance on the enemy and bring his close combat weapons to bear, but his legs wouldn't respond properly. One of them was actually partially buried still, stuck in the compacted debris that had held him prisoner for 4,000 years. He strained against it, servos whining with effort, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped, immobilized, a sitting target for the horde of Xenos that surrounded him. The Orks realized this at about the same time Cassian did, and their tactics immediately shifted. Instead of seeking cover and trading fire at range, they began to advance, emboldened by the Dreadnought's obvious inability to maneuver. They charged forward with their characteristic enthusiasm for close combat, brandishing choppers and power claws, whooping and hollering war cries in their brutal language. Cassian fired again, and this time his targeting had improved enough to actually hit some of his attackers. The assault cannon cut through Ork bodies with mechanical efficiency, reducing greenskin flesh to pulp and sending body parts flying. But for every Ork he killed, 2 more seemed to take its place, and they were getting closer with every second. His power fist struck out, catching one particularly brave Ork nob who'd gotten too close, and the unfortunate green skin was reduced to paste inside his armor. The power fist was still working perfectly, its ancient mechanisms having survived 4,000 years of burial with their lethality intact. But Cassian couldn't move it fast enough to catch all the Orks, swarming around his position, couldn't maneuver to bring it to bear on targets that were now climbing onto his chassis itself. This was bad. This was very, very bad. Brother Ancient Cassian had fought for hundreds of years before his original entombment, had faced everything from heretic Astartes to demonic incursions, and he'd always emerged victorious, or at least survived to fight another day. But those battles had been fought when he was mobile, when he had support, when his systems were in peak condition. Now he was alone, damaged, barely functional, and surrounded by enemies who were too stupid to know when they were facing a superior foe. The Orks on his chassis began attacking weak points with their crude tools and weapons. They hammered at sensor arrays, tried to pry open access panels, and generally behaved like the mechanically inclined vandals they were. Cassian tried to dislodge them with his power fist, but the weapon wasn't designed for that kind of precision work, and all he managed to do was tear chunks out of his own armor plating. That's when Throttle Grinder made his move. The big mech had been hanging back, watching the fight, analyzing the Hume fighting machine's capabilities and weaknesses. He'd noticed that while the thing could rotate its upper body to track targets, its legs were stuck fast, which meant it couldn't retreat or advance. He'd noticed that its targeting was slow and imprecise, probably because its machine spirit was still waking up or because its systems were damaged. And most importantly, he'd noticed the access panel that he'd opened earlier, the one that exposed some of the Dreadnought's critical internal systems. He grabbed a bundle of cables and a crude device he'd been working on, something he called a power siphon, though he wasn't entirely sure what it did, and charged forward. The Dreadnought's assault cannon swiveled toward him, but he juked left at the last second, and the stream of shells missed him by centimeters. He dove for the access panel, wedging himself into the narrow space, and began connecting his device to the Dreadnought's power systems. Cassian felt the intrusion immediately, felt foreign systems interfacing with his power core, trying to drain energy, trying to disrupt his functions. He attempted to override it, to shut down the affected systems, but the mech's device was crude enough that it didn't interface properly with his controls. It was like trying to grasp smoke. He could sense it was there, but couldn't get a proper grip on it to remove it. Power levels began to drop. Not catastrophically, not yet, but enough to notice. His assault cannon's rate of fire slowed. His power fist's energy field flickered. His motor controls became even more sluggish than they already were. The mech was doing exactly what mechs do best, finding ways to make technology do things it was never designed to do, usually destructive things. But Cassian was a veteran of centuries, a warrior who'd survived situations that would have killed lesser beings. He still had options. He couldn't move his legs, fine. He couldn't dislodge the mech who was siphoning his power, fine. But he could still fight, could still kill, could still make the greenskins pay for every second they continued to exist in his presence. He redirected power from non-essential systems, shut down redundant life support monitors, rerouted everything he could spare into his weapons. The assault cannon roared back to full capacity, and this time, instead of trying for precision shots, he simply swept it in a wide arc, hosing down everything in front of him with a solid wall of shells. Orks fell by the dozen, their bodies torn apart by the sustained fire, their blood turning the ground into a slick, treacherous mess. His power fist grabbed another orc who'd been trying to attach some kind of explosive to his optics, crushed the greenskin's skull like an overripe fruit, and then hurled the corpse into a group of his companions, bowling them over like pins. He was burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate, he knew, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was killing as many of these Xenos as possible before his systems finally gave out. The battle turned into a sustained slugfest. The Orks, instead of being intimidated by the Dreadnought's ferocity, seemed to get more excited. This was a proper fight, a real scrap against something that could actually hurt them, and that was exactly the kind of thing Orks lived for. They stopped trying to capture the machine intact and started going for a straight kill, bringing out their biggest guns and most powerful explosives. Rocket launchers fired their payloads at point-blank range, the missiles slamming into Cassian's armor and detonating with force enough to crack ceramite. Power claws tore at his plating, peeling it away in strips to expose the vulnerable systems beneath. Burnus bathed his chassis in superheated flame, trying to cook the life support systems, or at least make the pilot inside uncomfortable enough to surrender. Brother Ancient Cassian didn't surrender. Surrender wasn't in his vocabulary, wasn't in his programming, wasn't compatible with the oaths he'd taken when he'd been inducted into the Iron Hammers all those millennia ago. He would fight until his ammunition was exhausted, and then he would fight with his power fist alone, and when that failed, he would use the weight of his chassis itself as a weapon. He would fight until his reactor went critical and took them all with him, and if that happened, well, there were far worse ways for a space marine to die than taking a warband of orcs with him. The problem was that the orcs were learning. Every time Cassian killed one, the others observed how he'd done it and adjusted their tactics accordingly. They started attacking from his blind spots, the areas where his sensors had been damaged or where his weapon arcs couldn't reach. They coordinated their assaults, something orcs rarely did, with some of them drawing his fire while others snuck in to plant explosives or tear at his armor. And all the while, Throttle Grinder continued his work with the power siphon, draining energy, destabilizing systems, making the Dreadnought weaker with every passing moment. He'd also started attaching other devices, crude sensors and control systems that he hoped might let him influence the Humi machine's functions. He didn't fully understand how the Dreadnought worked, didn't need to, but he knew machines, and machines always had patterns, always had weak points, always had ways they could be controlled or manipulated if you were clever enough and persistent enough. The battle raged for what felt like hours. In reality, it was probably less than 20 minutes, but combat has a way of distorting time perception, especially when you're an ancient warrior waking up after 4,000 years to find yourself immediately fighting for your life. Brother Ancient Cassian killed dozens of orcs, maybe hundreds. He lost count after a while. His assault cannon finally ran dry, the ammunition hoppers that had seemed bottomless exhausted by the sustained firing. His power fist's energy field began to flicker and fail as power levels dropped to critical minimums. He was dying. He could feel it in ways that normal humans couldn't, could sense the degradation of his systems, the failure of components that had sustained him for longer than most civilizations existed. Part of him welcomed it. After 4,000 years of half-life, after waking up to find everything he'd known turned to dust, the prospect of final rest held a certain appeal. But another part, the part that was still a space marine at his core, refused to accept defeat at the hands of Xenos. His sensors detected a new threat, something big approaching his position. He tried to swivel his torso to track it, but his servos were failing, responding to his commands with agonizing slowness. When he finally managed to get visual confirmation, he saw what could only be described as a looted Ork Def Dread, a crude mockery of Imperial Dreadnought design, all exposed wiring and mismatched armor plates and way too many guns. The Def Dread charged him with its power claws extended, and Cassian had just enough time to think that dying to a cheap knockoff of his own chassis was somehow insulting, before the impact knocked what remained of his systems completely offline. His power core shut down in emergency mode, his life support switched to minimal backup systems, and his consciousness began to fade back into the darkness he'd been pulled from. His last thought before stasis claimed him again was a prayer, not for himself, but for his lost chapter, for the brothers he would never see again, for the Imperium he'd served across centuries and millennia. Then there was nothing, just darkness and silence, and the eternal now of a dreadnought at rest. When the Orks finally pried open the sarcophagus, carefully this time because Throttlegrinder wanted to see what was inside, they found what remained of Brother Ancient Cassian. It wasn't much to look at. A few organic components suspended in yellowed amniotic fluid. More machine than man at this point, ancient beyond reckoning. Some of the younger Orks were disappointed, having expected to find a whole Hume inside, maybe one they could interrogate or use for parts. Throttlegrinder examined the contents with professional interest. The life support systems were still functioning, he noted with approval. 4,000 years of burial and a sustained battle, and they still worked. That was quality engineering, the kind of quality that Humes sometimes managed when they weren't being too clever for their own good. The neural interface systems were fascinating too, far more sophisticated than anything Orks used in their death dreads. He wondered if he could replicate them, use them in his own creations. As for the organic remains themselves, well, they were useless to the Orks. No point trying to keep the Hume alive. Whatever he'd been before, he was used up now, burned out by millennia of service and one last desperate fight. Throttlegrinder made a perfunctory gesture of respect, the kind mechs sometimes showed to particularly well-made pieces of equipment, and then disconnected the life support. What remained of Brother Ancient Cassian died quietly, without ceremony, 4,000 and however many years after he'd first sworn his oaths to the Emperor. The real prize was the Dreadnought chassis itself. Despite the damage it had sustained during the battle, despite 4 millennia of burial, it was still fundamentally sound. The adamantium plating could be salvaged and reused. The weapon systems could be repaired or replaced. The power core, once Throttlegrinder figured out how to properly restart it, would provide more energy than a dozen Ork generators. This was the kind of loot that mechs dreamed about, the foundation for projects that would make them the envy of every workshop in the warband. To truly understand what happened next, we need to explore the Ork relationship with technology and looting in greater depth. Because while the immediate aftermath involved extracting the Dreadnought and preparing to modify it, the cultural significance of this find extended far beyond simple salvage operations. In Ork society, which barely qualifies as a society by the standards of other species, looting occupies a place somewhere between religion, economics, and entertainment. Every Ork is born with an innate appreciation for good loot. It's hardwired into their genetic structure, part of the biological programming that the old ones installed in their species millions of years ago. When an Ork sees something valuable, something useful, something that could make them bigger and stronger and more dangerous, they experience a genuine physiological response. Their heart rate increases, their pupils dilate, their brain releases chemicals that create feelings of excitement and desire. It's not greed in the human sense, not exactly, but something more primal and immediate. For the mech boys, this response is even stronger. A mech looking at a particularly sophisticated piece of technology experiences something approaching religious ecstasy. They see the components, understand the interactions, envision the modifications they could make, all in a fraction of a second. It's not learned knowledge, but instinctive awareness, flowing from genetic memory that reaches back to their species' creation. A mech doesn't study engineering, they simply know it, the way a bird knows how to build a nest, or a spider knows how to spin a web. This instinctive knowledge comes with limitations, of course. Ork mechs understand mechanical principles and basic physics, but they don't grasp the deeper theoretical frameworks that Imperial tech priests spend lifetimes studying. They can build an engine that works, but they couldn't explain thermodynamics. They can construct a weapon that fires projectiles, but they couldn't write down the mathematical equations governing ballistic trajectories. Their knowledge is practical, intuitive, and absolutely sufficient for their purposes. When Throttlegrinder looked at the Dreadnought, he didn't see millennia of Imperial engineering refinement, didn't appreciate the sophisticated integration of biological and mechanical systems, didn't recognize the ancient wisdom encoded in every design choice. What he saw was a big, metal thing, full of useful parts that could be repurposed, improved, and made properly, Orky. And in his worldview, that was exactly what it needed. The Dreadnought's assault cannon, for instance, was a masterpiece of weapons engineering, capable of sustained fire rates that would melt lesser weapons, equipped with cooling systems and recoil compensation that allowed for accuracy even during extended engagements. Throttlegrinder examined it with professional interest, noted that it worked on similar principles to Ork weapons, but was built with much tighter tolerances and more sophisticated mechanisms, and immediately began thinking about how he could make it better by making it worse. He could strip out about half the cooling systems, he figured, because Orks didn't mind if their weapons ran hot as long as they kept shooting. He could remove the recoil compensation because Orks were strong enough to handle the kick. He could modify the ammunition feed to accept larger shells because bigger bullets obviously did more damage. The fact that all of these modifications would reduce the weapon's reliability, accuracy, and operational lifespan didn't concern him. In Ork philosophy, a weapon that fires fewer shots, but each shot is bigger and louder, is superior to a weapon that fires many smaller shots reliably. The Power Fist presented different challenges and opportunities. It was designed to be wielded by a Dreadnought, which meant it was already scaled for something much larger than a normal warrior. The power field generator was sophisticated, producing an energy envelope that could disrupt molecular bonds and increase striking force without requiring excessive power input. Throttlegrinder could see several ways to adapt it for Ork use, most of which involved bypassing the safety interlocks and overcharging the power field until it became unstable and dangerous to the user. This wasn't incompetence on Throttlegrinder's part. He genuinely understood that removing safety features would make the weapon more likely to explode or electrocute its wielder. He simply didn't care. In the Ork value system, a weapon that occasionally kills the user is still a good weapon, as long as it kills the enemy more often. Risk is part of the appeal. Danger makes things more exciting. An Ork who dies because his own gun exploded has simply failed to be tough enough to handle proper weaponry. The armor plating was perhaps the most straightforward component to loot. Adamantium is valuable to any species, but especially to Orks, who constantly find themselves needing better protection for their vehicles and war machines. The Dreadnought's plates could be removed, cut to size, and welded onto anything that needed reinforcement. A battle wagon could get heavier frontal armor. A looted tank could patch weak spots where Imperial construction had proven insufficient. Even smaller vehicles could benefit from strategic placement of adamantium plating. But the most interesting component, the one that captured Throttlegrinder's imagination most completely, was the neural interface system. This was technology that allowed a mostly dead organic being to control a massive war machine through thought alone, to see through its sensors, to fire its weapons, to move its limbs as if they were natural extensions of the body. The sophistication required to make such a system work was staggering, involving precision electronics, biological monitoring, and signal processing that operated at the speed of nerve impulses. Throttlegrinder couldn't replicate it exactly. He knew that even as he examined it, understood that the tolerances involved were beyond what Ork manufacturing could achieve, that the materials required were probably unavailable, that the theoretical knowledge needed to design such a system from scratch was not part of his instinctive understanding. But he could make something similar. He could build a cruder version that accomplished the same basic goal, even if it did so in a way that was more painful, less reliable, and significantly more likely to drive the pilot insane. Ork Def Dreads already used a form of neural interface, after all. An Ork pilot was physically wired into the machine, their nervous system connected to the walker's controls through a combination of surgery and mech-boy intuition. It wasn't sophisticated, wasn't comfortable, and it tended to make the pilots gradually lose their minds as the boundaries between themselves and the machine blurred. But it worked, in the sense that the Death Dreads moved and fought, and occasionally lasted more than a few battles before breaking down or being destroyed. What Throttle Grinder envisioned was taking the Imperial system and Orkifying it. He would strip out the life support systems that kept the pilot alive indefinitely, because Orks didn't need that kind of mollycoddling. He would simplify the neural connections, reducing them to basic motor control and sensory input. He would eliminate the sophisticated monitoring systems that tracked pilot health and stress levels, because if an Ork couldn't handle being wired into a war machine, that was their problem. The result would be more intense, more immediate, more dangerous, and absolutely more Orky. The process of extracting the Dreadnought became a multi-day undertaking that involved most of the warband. Orks who weren't actively working on the excavation stood around offering advice, criticism, and occasional violence when their suggestions were ignored. The site became something of a gathering place, a focal point for the entire warband, as word spread about the amazing loot that had been found. Younger Orks wanted to see the Hume fighting machine that had killed so many of their fellows. They examined the bullet holes in its armor, the scars from power claw strikes, the blast marks from rockets and explosives. They listened with rapt attention as the survivors of the battle described the fight, how the ancient warrior had refused to surrender even when defeat was inevitable, how his weapons had torn through Ork ranks with mechanical precision. There was genuine respect in these accounts, the kind of respect that Orks reserve for particularly tough opponents. Older Orks, those who'd been looting for decades, examined the Dreadnought with more technical interest. They noted the quality of the construction, the sophistication of the systems, the care that had gone into every component. This was Hume tech at its finest, they agreed. Built to last, built to fight, built to standards that even Orks could appreciate. The fact that it was old, really old, older than any of them could properly comprehend, only added to its mystique. The mech boys formed the third group of observers, and they were by far the most excited. Every mech in the warband wanted a piece of this find, wanted access to the systems and components, wanted the chance to study Imperial engineering and steal its secrets. Arguments broke out constantly over who had rights to which parts. Arguments that Throttle Grinder had to mediate through a combination of shouting, threats, and occasionally actual violence. As the big mech and the one who'd found the thing in the first place, he had ultimate authority, but that didn't stop his colleagues from trying to negotiate, barter, or outright steal components when they thought he wasn't looking. Warboss Grackett observed all of this with satisfaction. A good loot find brought the boys together, gave them something to focus on besides fighting each other, reminded them why they were part of this warband instead of some other. The Dreadnought represented opportunity, the chance to build something truly impressive, something that would make other Orks jealous and draw more recruits to their ranks. In the strange calculus of Ork society, good loot equaled prestige, equaled power, equaled more boys, equaled more fighting, equaled more loot. It was a virtuous cycle, and this ancient Hume fighting machine had just given it a significant boost. The actual transport of the Dreadnought back to base camp required specialized equipment. They couldn't simply drag it through the ruins. It was too heavy, too unwieldy, too valuable to risk damaging further. Instead, they brought up a series of looted industrial equipment, cranes and lifters that had probably started life in Imperial manufactorums but had been modified beyond recognition. The mechs rigged up a system of chains and pulleys, arguing constantly about load distribution and stress points, until they had something that looked like it might work without immediately collapsing. The lift itself was a tense operation. The chains groaned under the weight, the lifters strained, and several Orks nearly got crushed when one of the support structures shifted unexpectedly. But Ork engineering, crude as it was, proved sufficient to the task. The Dreadnought was slowly, carefully raised from its burial site, rotated to a horizontal position, and lowered onto a massive transport platform that had been cobbled together from the beds of several destroyed trucks. Getting it back to base camp involved navigating several kilometers of rough terrain in a vehicle that wasn't really designed to carry such a concentrated load. The transport's suspension complained loudly, its wheels dug deep ruts into the ground, and the whole assembly swayed alarmingly on every incline. But Orks are nothing if not persistent, and they weren't about to let minor concerns like physics or structural integrity stop them from claiming their prize. When they finally rolled into base camp with the Dreadnought secured to its transport platform, the entire warband turned out to sea. Orks lined the route, cheering and hollering, firing their weapons into the air in celebration. This was a moment worth commemorating, a triumph worth recognizing. They'd found something amazing, fought it, beaten it, and brought it home. As far as most Orks were concerned, this was about as good as life got. Throttle Grinder immediately claimed the largest workshop in the camp, evicting its previous occupants with a combination of authority and threats. He needed space for this project, room to spread out all the components, area for his assistants to work without constantly getting in each other's way. The workshop, a ramshackle structure made from scavenged metal sheets and hope, became the center of activity for the entire warband. Over the following weeks, the Dreadnought was systematically disassembled. Every component was examined, catalogued in the haphazard way that Orks catalog anything, and sorted into piles based on utility and interest. The armor plates went into one corner, stacked haphazardly. The weapon systems were laid out on a workbench where multiple mechs could study them. The power core, still dangerous even in its shutdown state, was carefully isolated and surrounded by warning signs that most Orks couldn't read, but understood meant, "Don't mess with this unless you want to explode." The neural interface system was given special attention. Throttle Grinder spent days examining it, tracing connections, testing components, trying to understand not just how it worked, but how he could make it work for Orks. He brought in other mechs, including a painboy named Grotsnick, who specialized in the uncomfortable intersection of biology and mechanics. Together, they began designing their own version, sketching diagrams on any surface that would hold marks, arguing about details, occasionally testing theories on unfortunate grots who rarely survived the experience. The workshop became a place of constant noise and activity. Welders sparked, cutting torches roared, hammers clanged against metal. Mechs shouted at each other in technical jargon that other Orks couldn't understand and didn't want to. Assistants ran back and forth carrying components, tools, and sometimes injured colleagues who'd had accidents with power tools or temperamental technology. The smell of ozone, burning metal, and spilled promethium hung heavy in the air. Outside the workshop, the rest of the warband prepared for what was to come. Because everyone knew that once Throttle Grinder finished his project, once Gork's Fist was complete and operational, they would need to test it properly. And proper testing meant finding enemies to fight, which meant going on a raid, which meant the kind of violence that Orks lived for. There was an atmosphere of anticipation throughout the camp, a building excitement that manifested in increased brawling, louder arguments, and general restlessness. Some of the boys started making modifications to their own equipment, inspired by the Dreadnought find. If the mechs could loot Humitech and make it better, why couldn't regular boys do the same? This led to a surge of creative weapon modifications, most of which were terrible ideas that ended badly. But a few actually worked, producing guns that fired faster or hit harder or made impressive noises. And these successes encouraged more experimentation. The Orks spent the next several days extracting the Dreadnought from its burial site, a task that required heavy equipment, lots of shouting, and occasional violence when disagreements broke out over the best way to proceed. Eventually, they managed to haul it to the surface and transport it back to their base camp, where Throttle Grinder could begin the process of studying it properly. The construction of Gork's Fist became an undertaking that consumed weeks of effort and resources that would have been better spent on other projects, if Orks cared about efficiency or resource management. But they didn't. So every scrap of material that could be spared went into making Throttlegrinder's vision a reality. The big mech worked with a feverish intensity that worried even other orcs, barely sleeping, barely eating, utterly consumed by his project. The base chassis remained largely intact, though heavily modified. Throttlegrinder kept the fundamental structure because it was well designed and because completely rebuilding it would have required more time and effort than even he was willing to invest. But he made changes everywhere he could, adding reinforcement plates where he thought the armor was too thin, cutting away sections he deemed unnecessary, welding on mounting points for weapons the Imperial designers had never imagined. The legs received special attention. The original design had prioritized stability and all-terrain capability, with sophisticated gyroscopic systems and hydraulic shock absorbers. Throttlegrinder ripped out about half of these systems, replacing them with cruder mechanisms that he understood better and could maintain more easily. The result was that Gork's fist walked with a noticeable limp and tended to lurch when making turns, but it could still move, and that was what mattered. The weapon systems underwent the most dramatic changes. The original assault cannon was mounted on one arm, but Throttlegrinder added a second assault cannon to the other arm because two guns were obviously better than one. Never mind that the power core wasn't really designed to handle the energy requirements of dual assault cannons, or that the recoil from both weapons firing simultaneously would probably destabilize the entire chassis. If it worked, it would be amazing. If it didn't work, well, that would be amazing in a different way. He added rocket pods to the shoulders, scavenged from destroyed vehicles and modified to fit. He welded on a flamer unit taken from an Imperial tank, positioning it in the center of the chassis where it could swivel to engage targets the main weapons couldn't reach. He attached power claws to the feet, because why shouldn't every part of the machine be a weapon? By the time he was finished, Gork's fist bristled with armaments, looking less like a refined Imperial war machine and more like a walking arsenal that had been assembled during an earthquake. The power core presented ongoing challenges. Imperial reactors were designed with numerous safety features, redundant systems, and fail-safes that would shut everything down if parameters exceeded safe operating levels. Throttlegrinder viewed all of these as unnecessary complications that just got in the way of maximum performance. He bypassed most of the safety systems, increased the power output by removing governor controls, and generally treated the ancient reactor with all the care and respect that orcs typically show to dangerous equipment, which is to say, none whatsoever. Painboy Grotznik handled the neural interface modifications with the kind of enthusiasm that made even other orcs uncomfortable. He took the sophisticated Imperial system, studied how it connected to organic tissue, and designed a brutally simplified version that could be installed in an orc pilot. The installation process would be agonizing, would probably cause permanent psychological damage, and had better than even odds of killing the pilot outright. Grotznik saw all of this as acceptable trade-offs for the ability to control such a powerful war machine. The volunteer for the pilot position was an orc named Skull Crusher, a veteran fighter who'd lost both legs to a landmine and half his face to a chainsword. He was tough enough to survive the installation process, mean enough to want revenge on everything that had ever hurt him, and crazy enough to think that being permanently wired into a war machine sounded like fun. He was, in other words, the perfect candidate. The installation took an entire day and involved more screaming than most orc medical procedures, which was saying something. Grotznik cut away most of Skull Crusher's remaining organic body, leaving just enough to maintain brain function and house the critical organs. What remained was placed in a crude sarcophagus that Throttlegrinder had built from scavenged components and wishful thinking. The neural connections were made with all the precision of a blindfolded grot wielding a hammer, which is to say, they were made, and they mostly worked, and that was considered a success. When Skull Crusher's consciousness finally emerged from the surgical anesthesia, which in orc medicine meant he'd been hit on the head hard enough to pass out, the first thing he experienced was overwhelming sensory input from the Dreadnought systems. He could see through cameras mounted all over the chassis, giving him a 360-degree field of vision that his brain wasn't equipped to process. He could feel the weight of the machine, the tension in its joints, the flow of power through its systems. It was too much, far too much, and he screamed. But Skullcrusher was, above all else, tough. He'd survived battles that killed harder orcs. He'd endured injuries that would have finished lesser warriors. He wasn't about to let something as minor as overwhelming pain and sensory overload stop him from controlling the biggest, stompiest fighting machine the warband had ever built. He forced his mind to adapt, to process the input, to make sense of the chaos. And slowly, agonizingly, he learned to move. The first test of Gork's fist was less a careful evaluation of systems and more a chaotic demonstration of what happens when you give an orc control of a heavily armed war machine with minimal training. Skullcrusher lurched forward, overcorrected, nearly fell, caught himself, and then took 3 stomping steps that cracked the ground beneath the machine's feet. The assembled orcs cheered. This was exactly what they'd wanted to see. Movement, power, the promise of violence to come. The weapons test came next. Skullcrusher, still learning to coordinate his new body's systems, attempted to fire the assault cannons at some targets that had been set up in the testing ground. What resulted was a sustained burst of fire that went everywhere except where it was aimed, chewing up ground, demolishing a nearby structure that had been someone's workshop, and nearly hitting several orcs who'd gotten too close in their enthusiasm. The watchers cheered even louder. This was perfect. This was amazing. This was everything they'd hoped for. Over the following days, Skullcrusher practiced controlling Gork's fist, learning to walk without falling, to turn without toppling, to fire weapons with something approaching accuracy. The learning process involved numerous crashes, several near-catastrophic system failures, and one incident where the power core nearly went critical and had to be emergency shut down by throttle grinder. But with each mishap, the pilot got better, his brain adapting to the machine's quirks, his instincts learning to work with rather than against the Orky modifications. The paint job was the final touch, and it became a matter of intense debate among the warband. Red would make it faster, obviously, but yellow would make the explosions bigger. Blue would make it lucky. Green was just proper because green was the orc color. Black and white had various effects that different orcs swore by. The compromise was to paint it all of them in a garish pattern that looked like it had been designed by colorblind grots having a seizure. It was hideous. It was perfect. It was exactly what an Orky war machine should look like. Gork's fist in its completed form stood nearly 5 meters tall, weighed several tons more than the original Dreadnought due to all the added weapons and armor, and bristled with enough firepower to level a small building. It moved with a jerky, unpredictable gait that suggested imminent collapse, but somehow never quite fell over. Its weapons, a chaotic mix of Imperial technology and Ork modifications, could unleash devastating firepower in every direction, though accuracy remained something of a secondary concern. It was, by any objective measure, an engineering disaster. It was also, by Ork standards, a masterpiece. The warband celebrated its completion with the kind of party that Orks specialize in. Lots of fighting, lots of drinking, lots of accidental injuries. Warboss Grackett himself came to inspect the finished machine, walked around it several times, examining the modifications, and then declared it proper killy. This was the highest praise an Ork boss could give, and it settled any remaining debates about whether the project had been worth the effort. What followed was a masterclass in Ork engineering, which is to say it was an exercise in creative destruction, tempered with just enough intelligence to be dangerous. Throttle Grinder took the Dreadnought apart piece by piece, examining every component, testing every system, trying to understand how the Humies had made it all work. He was particularly interested in the neural interface, the sophisticated systems that had allowed a mostly dead Humie to control such a massive machine with thought alone. Could he replicate it for Ork use? Probably not exactly, but he could make something similar, something Orky. He started sketching designs. rough blueprints that existed more in his head than on any actual paper, for a supersized Def Dread that would use modified versions of the Imperial systems. It would be bigger than any Def Dread the warband had ever built, more powerful, more heavily armed. It would be, in his own words, proper stompy. Other mechs wanted pieces of the Dreadnought for their own projects. The assault cannon could be modified to fit on a battle wagon. The power fist could be scaled up even further and used as the weapon for a stomper. The armor plating could reinforce weak points on vehicles that had been held together with little more than hope and scrap metal. Arguments broke out over who got what, arguments that sometimes escalated into fights, but Throttle Grinder managed to maintain enough control to ensure that the most critical components went to the projects that made the most sense. And in a workshop in the warband's base camp, Throttle Grinder began to build his masterpiece. He took the core chassis of the ancient Dreadnought and modified it, welding on additional armor plates looted from destroyed vehicles, adding weapon mounts in places no sane Imperial engineer would ever consider, painting everything in bright colors because Orks liked bright colors, and it made things go faster or hit harder or something. The final result was something that would have made tech priests weep, a looted Dreadnought that was somehow both more and less than it had been before. It was christened Gork's Fist at a ceremony that involved a lot of drinking, some impromptu brawls, and the ritual smashing of a particularly worthless grot against the machine's armor, plating for luck. And when it was finally activated, when an Ork pilot was welded into the control systems and the power core rumbled to life, it actually worked. It shouldn't have, by all rights. The modifications were crude. The understanding of the underlying principles was minimal, and half the systems had been replaced with Ork equivalents that barely functioned. But the combination of genuine Ork engineering skill, scavenged Imperial technology, and the Gestalt psychic field that all greenskins generated was enough to make it work. Gork's Fist stomped across the testing ground, its movements jerky and unpredictable, but undeniably functional. Its weapons fired, filling the air with noise and destruction. The pilot inside, an Ork who'd volunteered for the honor of being the first to control the new machine, was having the time of his life, laughing and shouting as he made the looted Dreadnought smash and shoot everything in sight. Warboss Grackett watched the display with satisfaction. This was what Orks did. They found stuff, they looted stuff, they made the stuff work for them. Didn't matter if it was Humi tech or Eldar tech or even Necron tech. If it could be bashed into a shape that Orks could use, they'd use it. And this particular piece of loot, this ancient Dreadnought that had been buried for 4,000 years, had given them something special. The warband's reputation grew. Word spread through the Ork underworld about Grackett's boys, about the massive looted war machine they'd built, about how they'd found and beaten an ancient Humi fighting machine. Other Orks wanted to join up, wanted to be part of a warband that could pull off that kind of loot. The warband grew larger, more powerful, more dangerous. Eventually, Imperial authorities became aware of the situation. Reports filtered in through various channels about Ork activity on a dead world that was supposed to be lifeless, about a warband that was getting bigger and more aggressive. When investigation teams finally arrived, they found the excavation site, found the debris from the battle, found enough evidence to piece together what had happened. The discovery sent ripples through Imperial command structures. A Dreadnought of the Iron Hammers. Chapter had been recovered by Orks. The chapter itself was dead, had been dead for 4,000 years, but the machine and its pilot had somehow survived all that time, only to fall into Xenos hands. From the Imperium's perspective, this was both a tragedy and an outrage. Ancient relics of dead chapters were supposed to be recovered and placed in museums or chapter crypts, not looted and desecrated by greenskins. The initial investigation was conducted by a team from the Adeptus Mechanicus, tech priests, who specialized in locating and cataloging lost technology. They arrived on the dead world in a small escort ship, bringing with them scanning equipment and servitors to excavate the site. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Clear evidence of a Dreadnought sarcophagus, battle damage consistent with high-caliber Ork weapons, signs of forced entry into the machine's systems. The lead tech priest, an archmagos named Vex-29, conducted a thorough analysis of the site. He examined the empty grave where the Dreadnought had been buried, studied the patterns of excavation, collected fragments of armor and components that the Orks had left behind. His report, transmitted back to his Forge world with maximum priority encryption, laid out the situation in stark terms. An ancient and irreplaceable piece of the Omnissiah's legacy had been defiled by Xenos, and immediate action was required to prevent further desecration. The report made its way through Imperial bureaucracy with surprising speed, aided by the fact that several different organizations had interest in the matter. The Adeptus Mechanicus wanted to recover the Dreadnought, or at least its components, viewing them as sacred relics that belonged in their vaults. The Inquisition wanted to investigate whether the Orks had gained any dangerous technological insights from their find. And the Space Marines, particularly those chapters that had maintained historical ties to the Iron Hammers, wanted to ensure that their ancient brothers received proper burial rites. The decision was made to organize a punitive expedition, a military force large enough to destroy the Ork warband and recover whatever remained of the Dreadnought. The composition of this force reflected the multiple interests involved. A full company of Space Marines from the Crimson Paladins chapter, 3 regiments of Imperial Guard infantry, a detachment of Mechanicus Scutari, and supporting armor and artillery. It was a massive commitment of resources for what amounted to a recovery operation, but the Imperium had learned through bitter experience that Ork looting could not be allowed to go unanswered. The Crimson Paladins took particular interest in the mission because their chapter maintained records indicating that they had fought alongside the Iron Hammers during the Great Crusade. The connection was ancient and tenuous, based on a few shared campaigns nearly 10,000 years ago, but it was enough to make them feel a sense of obligation to their lost brothers. Their chapter master, a venerable warrior named Marcus Thane, personally led the company assigned to the expedition, viewing it as a matter of honor that could not be delegated. The Imperial Guard regiments were drawn from local forces, garrison troops who'd been stationed in the sector and needed something to do. They approached the mission with the mixture of professionalism and fatalism that characterized the Guard. They would do their duty, many of them would die, and the survivors would be reassigned to the next war zone. The fact that they were fighting to recover an ancient artifact meant less to them than the prospect of a good fight, and perhaps some loot of their own. The Mechanicus contingent was the most invested in the outcome. They viewed every piece of lost technology as a tragedy, every recovered relic as a triumph. The fact that this particular artifact had been in Ork hands, had been modified and desecrated, made its recovery even more urgent. If they could retrieve even fragments of the original Dreadnought, if they could study what the Orks had done to it, they might learn something valuable about both Imperial engineering and Xenos corruption of sacred machines. The expedition assembled over a period of weeks, gathering ships and supplies, coordinating troop movements, planning the assault. Intelligence gathering proved difficult because the dead world where the Orks had established their base was remote and poorly mapped. Reconnaissance drones sent ahead were either destroyed or lost, forcing the Imperial forces to rely on fragmentary data and guesswork about the enemy's strength and disposition. What they didn't know was that the Orks had continued to grow in number and power. The discovery of the Dreadnought and the subsequent construction of Gork's Fist had drawn attention from other warbands, smaller groups of greenskins who saw opportunity in joining a successful boss. Grakit's warband had swelled from a few hundred to nearly 2,000 Orks, with more arriving every day. They'd established a proper base camp with workshops, supply depots, and even crude defensive fortifications. They were, by Ork standards, organized and ready for a fight. When the Imperial fleet arrived in orbit above the dead world, Grakit and his boys were actually disappointed that it had taken so long. They'd been spoiling for a proper scrap ever since Gork's Fist had been completed, and the arrival of Hume forces meant they'd finally get one. The defensive preparations that had been made were less about surviving the assault and more about ensuring maximum entertainment value from the inevitable battle. The Imperial assault began with orbital bombardment, a standard opening move designed to soften up enemy positions before ground forces deployed. But the Orks had prepared for this, digging bunkers and reinforcing structures, ensuring that they could survive the initial bombardment and emerge ready to fight. When the shelling stopped and the first drop pods began to fall from orbit, the Greenskins were waiting with weapons ready and enthusiasm high. The Space Marines hit multiple targets simultaneously, drop pods crashing into Ork positions with the kind of precision that years of training and centuries of experience provided. They emerged from the pods firing, bolters speaking their deadly chorus, chainswords revving, their armor painted in the crimson and gold of their chapter. They expected resistance, expected casualties, expected a hard fight. What they didn't expect was Gork's fist. Skullcrusher had been waiting for this moment since he'd been wired into the machine. He'd practiced, trained, learned to use his new body with something approaching proficiency. When the Humies dropped from their skyboats, when the battle finally began, he was ready. Gork's fist stomped into the middle of the fighting with all weapons blazing, assault cannons roaring, rockets screaming from shoulder pods, flamers bathing everything in superheated promethium. The sight of a looted Dreadnought, garish in its multicolored paint scheme and bristling with twice as many weapons as it should carry, charging into their ranks with obvious hostile intent, shocked the Space Marines in ways that few things could. These were warriors who'd faced demonic incursions and Xenos horrors beyond counting. But there was something particularly offensive about seeing their ancient brother's tomb reduced to this, to an Ork toy, painted in clashing colors and modified beyond recognition. Chapter Master Thane immediately recognized what he was looking at, identified the base structure as Imperial Dreadnought design, even under all the Orky modifications. He issued orders through the Vox network, designating Gork's fist as priority target, directing fire teams to concentrate on bringing it down. But coordinating such an assault while under fire from hundreds of enthusiastic Orks proved difficult, and Skullcrusher was having the time of his life. The looted Dreadnought tore through Imperial lines with abandon. It was not as skilled as a proper Dreadnought pilot, not as disciplined, not as coordinated. But it made up for these deficiencies with sheer aggression and the kind of reckless courage that came from being an Ork with access to really big guns. Space Marines fell to its assault cannon fire. Skitarii were crushed beneath its feet. Imperial Guard infantry broke and ran when it charged their positions, flamers clearing trenches with gouts of fire that turned men into screaming torches. But weight of numbers and superior coordination began to tell. The Space Marines adapted their tactics, engaging Gork's fist from multiple angles, targeting weak points in its armor, exploiting the sluggish response times that Throttle Grinder's modifications had introduced. Lascannon fire from Imperial tanks carved chunks out of its plating. Melter weapons burned through exposed systems, and gradually, inevitably, the looted Dreadnought began to fail. Skullcrusher felt his machine dying around him, felt systems shutting down, felt the neural interface starting to fray as damage accumulated. He could have surrendered, could have ejected from the chassis if such a system had existed, could have tried to save himself. But he was an Ork, and Orks don't surrender, and he was going to take as many Humies with him as he could manage before the end. His final act was to activate the reactor overload that Throttle Grinder had built into the system, a last resort weapon that would turn Gork's fist into a massive bomb. The Imperial forces had seconds to recognize what was happening, to scatter, to take cover. Some made it, many didn't. When the reactor went critical, and the resulting explosion vaporized everything within a 50-meter radius, it took dozens of Imperial soldiers with it, along with what remained of Brother Ancient Cassian's tomb. The loss of Gork's fist marked the turning point of the battle. Without their most powerful weapon, without the psychological impact of the looted Dreadnought tearing through Imperial ranks, the Orks began to lose cohesion. Warboss Grakit fought bravely, his power claw tearing through Space Marine armor, his iron jaw still grinning even as blessed bolter rounds found their mark. But eventually, he too fell, crushed beneath the Crozius of a chaplain who'd sworn an oath to avenge the desecrated Dreadnought. Throttle Grinder died in his workshop, trying desperately to repair battle damage on some vehicle or weapon, surrounded by the tools and components he'd spent his life working with. A falling piece of debris from an orbital strike crushed him, ending one of the warband's most talented mechs without ceremony or glory. The other Orks, leaderless and facing overwhelming force, did what Orks do when a fight turns against them. They scattered, fleeing into the ruins of the dead world, breaking up into smaller groups, looking for ways to escape, or at least find enemies they could actually beat. The Imperial forces secured the battlefield over the following days, establishing control over the Ork base camp, cataloguing equipment and weapons, searching for anything that remained of the Dreadnought. What they found was disappointing. Fragments of armor plating embedded in crater walls, pieces of weapons systems scattered across a wide area, components so damaged that even the Mechanicus couldn't identify what they'd originally been. The explosion that had destroyed Gork's fist had been thorough, leaving almost nothing intact. Almost nothing, but not quite nothing. Deep in Throttle Grinder's workshop, protected by layers of scrap and debris, Archmagos Vex 29's servitors found a small container holding what appeared to be data crystals. The mech had apparently been trying to understand the Dreadnought systems thoroughly enough to document them, recording his observations in a format he could reference later. The crystals contained corrupt and fragmentary information, filtered through an Ork's limited understanding, but they were something. They were salvage. They were proof that the Dreadnought had existed, had been found, had fought its last battle against the enemies who'd awakened it. The Crimson Paladins held a ceremony on the battlefield where Brother Ancient Cassian had made his final stand against the Orks, 4,000 years after his chapter had fallen. They spoke the words of remembrance, honored his service, and acknowledged that while his physical form was lost, his deeds would not be forgotten. It was small comfort, but it was all they could offer. What remained of the Dreadnought fragments, the pieces that could be positively identified as having been part of the original Imperial chassis, were collected with reverence and transported to the Crimson Paladins' fortress monastery. There they were placed in a memorial chamber dedicated to lost chapters and fallen heroes, joining relics from dozens of other ancient battles. A plaque was inscribed with what little information could be verified about Brother Ancient Cassian: his name, his chapter, the approximate date of his entombment, and a brief account of his final battle. The Mechanicus took their share of the salvage back to their forge world, where it would be studied, analyzed, and eventually added to their archives. They were particularly interested in Throttle Grinder's notes, crude as they were, because they represented a unique perspective on Imperial technology viewed through Xenos eyes. Understanding how Orks thought about and modified captured equipment could prove useful in future conflicts. The Imperial Guard buried their dead, tallied their casualties, and prepared for reassignment to the next war zone. They'd fought well, suffered acceptable losses, and completed their mission as far as they were concerned. The fact that they'd been part of a recovery operation to retrieve an ancient relic mattered less to them than the fact that they'd survived and would get to fight another day. A punitive expedition was organized, a company of Space Marines from a chapter that had maintained ties with the Iron Hammers, backed by Imperial Guard regiments and supported by the Adeptus Mechanicus. Their mission was simple: destroy the Ork warband, recover whatever remained of the Iron Hammer's legacy, and ensure that Brother Ancient Cassian received the honors he was due, even if those honors came 4,000 years too late. The battle was fierce. Grakit's warband had grown large enough by this point to put up a real fight, and they had Gork's Fist leading their charges, the looted Dreadnought smashing through Imperial lines with devastating effect. But numbers and coordination eventually told. The Space Marines were too disciplined, too well equipped, too determined to avenge their ancient brothers. The Imperial Guard brought overwhelming firepower. The Mechanicus deployed technologies that countered the Orks' ramshackle weapons. In the end, Grackett fell to a chaplain's Crozius, his iron jaw finally proving insufficient to protect him from the Emperor's wrath. Throttlegrinder died, trying to repair Gork's fist mid-battle, crushed when the machine toppled over after taking a direct hit from a Lascannon. The warband broke and fled, scattered to the solar winds, the survivors carrying with them only stories of the great loot they'd found and lost. The Imperial forces recovered what they could. Gork's fist was barely recognizable as the ancient Dreadnought it had been, so heavily modified and damaged that only fragments remained of the original machine. Those fragments were catalogued, blessed, and transported to the nearest chapter monastery, where they were placed in a reliquary dedicated to the lost iron hammers. Brother Ancient Cassian's remains, what little the Orks had left, were given full honors. A ceremony was held, attended by representatives from multiple chapters, where his service was commemorated and his sacrifice remembered. He was laid to rest in a tomb alongside other ancient heroes, his name added to rolls of honor that stretched back millennia. It wasn't the ending he might have chosen, but it was better than being forgotten in the darkness beneath a nameless world. But this story, the story of what happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that's been buried for 4,000 years, doesn't end with Imperial victory and proper burial rites. Because throughout the galaxy, on countless forgotten worlds, there are other Dreadnoughts sleeping beneath rubble and ruins. Ancient warriors from dead chapters, from lost companies, from battles so old that their very names have been forgotten. They sleep and wait, their life support systems keeping them in stasis, their weapon systems ready to activate, their pilots dreaming dreams that might span millennia. And there are always Orks looking for loot. On a dozen different worlds, similar scenarios play out. Ork scavengers dig through ruins and find ancient war machines. Sometimes they trigger immediate awakening, leading to desperate battles between half-functional dreadnoughts and excited greenskins. Sometimes they manage to extract the machines intact, hauling them back to workshops where mechs can study them and modify them. Sometimes the dreadnoughts are too damaged to ever wake again, and they're simply torn apart for components, their pilots dying quietly without ever knowing they've been found. Each encounter follows its own unique path, shaped by the specific circumstances, the particular Orks involved, and the condition of the dreadnought they find. But certain patterns emerge, consistent behaviors that speak to fundamental truths about both Orks and the ancient warriors they discover. When the dreadnought is functional enough to fight, the Orks are always thrilled. This is what they live for, proper fights against opponents who can actually threaten them. They'll throw themselves into battle with enthusiasm, accepting casualties that would make any other military force retreat, because to an Ork, dying in a good fight is better than living through a boring day. The more dangerous the dreadnought proves to be, the more excited the Orks become, the louder they cheer, the harder they fight. When the dreadnought is too damaged to pose a real threat, the Orks' focus shifts to looting. They'll still approach with caution, because you never know when Humi tech might have surprises, but their primary concern becomes extracting maximum value from the find. Mechs will argue over who gets which components. Bosses will claim the best bits for themselves. Lesser Orks will fight over scraps, sometimes literally coming to blows over a piece of armor plating or a section of cable. The psychological impact on the dreadnought pilot, when they're awakened, is consistently devastating. Imagine sleeping for thousands of years, then waking to find yourself surrounded by enemies, your chapter gone, the Imperium you knew transformed beyond recognition. Some pilots handle it better than others, their training and conditioning allowing them to compartmentalize the horror and focus on fighting. Others break, their minds unable to process the scope of their loss, and they either shut down entirely or lash out with incoherent fury. From the Orks' perspective, every dreadnought is a prize worth fighting for, even if the fight kills half the warband. The technology alone justifies the casualties, but there's more to it than that. Finding and defeating such a powerful opponent grants prestige, earns respect from other Orks, proves that your warband is tough enough to handle the biggest challenges the galaxy can throw at you. And if you can loot the Dreadnought successfully, if you can turn its weapons and systems to Orky purposes, that's even better. The modifications that Orks make to capture Dreadnoughts follow predictable patterns, shaped by their limited understanding and unlimited enthusiasm. They always add more weapons, because more dakka is better. They always apply ridiculous paint schemes, because they genuinely believe that red makes things go faster and yellow makes explosions bigger. They always reinforce weak points with whatever armor is available, often creating bizarre patchwork exteriors that look like they were assembled by committee in the dark. But here's the thing. It works. Not as well as proper Imperial engineering, not as reliably, not with anything approaching the efficiency that the original designers intended. But Ork modifications to Dreadnoughts actually function, at least most of the time, at least well enough to stomp around and shoot things, and generally cause mayhem. The combination of mechboy intuition and the Gestalt psychic field ensures that even the most absurd modifications have a chance of working. The Imperium's response to these incidents is always the same: horror, outrage, and eventual punitive action. Losing a Dreadnought to Orks is seen as a failure on multiple levels. It means ancient relics are being desecrated. It means powerful weapons are falling into enemy hands. It means warriors who gave everything for the Emperor are being denied the honors they deserve. Recovery operations are given high priority, often elevated above missions that might seem more strategically important, because allowing Orks to keep captured Dreadnoughts sets a dangerous precedent. But the galaxy is vast, the Imperium is stretched thin, and there are only so many Space Marine companies available for recovery operations. For every Dreadnought successfully retrieved from Ork hands, there are probably a dozen that are never found, that end up as components in Ork vehicles, that die their final deaths in workshops far from Imperial space. It's a mathematics problem with no good solution. Infinite fronts, limited forces, endless losses. The Mechanicus maintains records of every known Dreadnought, tracking their deployments, their pilots, their chapter affiliations. When one goes missing, they update their databases, note the loss, estimate the probability of eventual recovery. But after a certain amount of time, usually measured in centuries rather than decades, the entry is marked as presumed destroyed, and the Mechanicus moves on to more immediate concerns. They don't forget exactly, but they stop actively searching. This means that across the galaxy, there are Dreadnoughts whose existence has been forgotten by everyone except the Orks, who occasionally stumble across them. Ancient warriors from chapters that the Imperium itself has forgotten, from battles that have passed entirely out of recorded history, from eras when the Imperium looked different than it does now. They sleep beneath ruins and ash, waiting for awakenings that may never come, or that may come at the hands of enemies who will neither understand nor respect what they represent. And that brings us to perhaps the most tragic aspect of this entire scenario. When Brother Ancient Cassian was awakened after 4,000 years, when he fought his last battle against the Orks who'd found him, he did so believing that he was defending the Imperium, upholding his oaths, serving the Emperor. He didn't know that his chapter was dead. He didn't know that 4 millennia had passed. He didn't know that the battle he was fighting was ultimately meaningless, that win or lose, he was already forgotten, already lost to history. Did he deserve better? Of course he did. Every Space Marine entombed in a Dreadnought deserves better than to sleep for millennia and then die in obscurity fighting Xenos on a forgotten world. But the universe doesn't care about what people deserve, especially not in the grim darkness of the far future. It only cares about what is, and what is includes ancient warriors sleeping beneath ash and Orks, digging through ruins looking for loot. So what happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that's been buried for 4,000 years? They wake it up, probably by accident. They fight it, because fighting is what Orks do. They kill it or loot it or both, depending on how things go. They turn its weapons and armor into new tools of destruction. They add it to their collection of stories about great fights and greater loot. And then they move on to the next world, the next ruin, the next prize waiting to be discovered. And somewhere else in the galaxy, another dreadnought sleeps, dreaming dreams of battles long past and brothers long dead, waiting for an awakening that may come from friends or enemies or not at all. The cycle continues, as it has for 10,000 years, as it will for 10,000 more. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and there are always orcs looking for a good fight and some decent loot. The story of Brother Ancient Cassian and Gork's Fist spread through various channels, taking different forms depending on who was telling it. Among the Crimson Paladins and other Space Marine chapters, with ties to the Lost Iron Hammers, it became a cautionary tale about the importance of recovering fallen brothers, about never leaving sacred technology in enemy hands, about the eternal vigilance required to honor those who served before. Among the Mechanicus, it became a case study in Xenos corruption of Imperial systems, documentation of how Ork mechs approached and modified captured technology, reminder that knowledge could be found even in tragedy. Among the Orks, the story took on different dimensions entirely. The few survivors of Grakit's warband carried tales of the magnificent fighting machine they'd built, of the glorious battles it had fought, of the Humies it had killed before finally being brought down. In their telling, the story grew and evolved, acquiring details that might or might not have been true. Some versions claim that Gork's Fist had killed 100 Humie warriors before falling. Others insisted it had destroyed entire tanks with single shots. A few even suggested that Skullcrusher had survived the explosion somehow and was still out there, wandering the galaxy in what remained of his machine, looking for new fights. None of these embellished versions were accurate, but accuracy wasn't the point. The point was that Grakit's warband had found something amazing, had turned it into something even better, and had used it to fight the Humies to a standstill before finally being overwhelmed. That was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth aspiring to replicate, and it encouraged other Orks to look for similar opportunities, to dig deeper into ruins, to search more thoroughly through ancient battlefields, because who knew what other treasures might be waiting to be found? This is where the true danger of the situation manifested. Every time an Ork warband found and looted an Imperial Dreadnought, it set a precedent, demonstrated that such things were possible, encouraged others to try. The galaxy is vast beyond human comprehension, filled with countless dead worlds and forgotten battlefields. Thousands of engagements have taken place across the millennia, wars that were fought and concluded before being buried under new conflicts and fresh catastrophes. And in many of these ancient battlefields, dreadnoughts sleep, waiting for recovery that may never come. The Imperium tracks what it can. The Administratum maintains records, vast archives documenting deployments and casualties, equipment allocations and combat losses. But the bureaucracy is imperfect, slow, prone to errors that compound across centuries. Records get lost. Data becomes corrupted. Entire conflicts are forgotten as the officials who remembered them die and are replaced by successors who have their own immediate concerns. The result is that there are almost certainly dreadnoughts that the Imperium doesn't know are missing, ancient warriors whose existence has been completely erased from official records. For these forgotten warriors, Orks represent perhaps the only chance of being found at all. An Imperial recovery team requires knowledge that a dreadnought is missing, requires resources to mount a search, requires the political will to prioritize such a mission over countless other demands. But Orks just need to stumble across something while digging through ruins looking for scrap. They don't need official authorization or dedicated resources. They'll find things simply through the brute force method of searching everywhere and taking everything that looks valuable. This creates a strange situation where Orks, the least sophisticated and least respectful faction in the galaxy, are inadvertently serving as archaeological excavators. uncovering relics that would otherwise remain buried forever. They don't preserve these finds, don't respect their historical significance, don't care about their cultural value, but they do find them, which is more than can be said for most other groups. And sometimes, just sometimes, the Imperium learns about these discoveries in time to mount recovery operations. The challenge is determining which finds are worth recovering. The Imperium has finite resources, can't respond to every reported Ork looting operation, can't chase down every rumor of ancient technology in Xenos hands. Priorities must be established. Decisions must be made about which relics are valuable enough to justify military intervention and which must be written off as acceptable losses. These decisions are made by committees and councils, groups of officials who weigh strategic concerns against cultural significance, who balance the value of recovered technology against the cost in lives and material. Dreadnoughts generally rank high in these calculations because they represent multiple valuable assets. They're powerful weapons systems that can be returned to service. They're historical artifacts that preserve knowledge of ancient chapters and battles. They're sacred relics that inspire devotion and maintain morale among Space Marine chapters. And perhaps most importantly, they contain the preserved remains of warriors who gave everything for the Emperor, who deserve to be recovered and honored rather than left in enemy hands. But ranking high doesn't mean guaranteed recovery. It means that when an Ork warband is found to have looted a Dreadnought, the matter will be investigated, assessed, and potentially acted upon. Whether action actually occurs depends on dozens of factors: the strategic situation in the sector, the availability of military forces, the political connections of the chapter whose Dreadnought was lost, the current priorities of the Inquisition and Mechanicus. Sometimes everything aligns and a recovery operation is mounted quickly. Sometimes it takes years or decades before resources become available. Sometimes the decision is made that the cost is simply too high and the Dreadnought is officially written off as a loss. This last option is particularly difficult for Space Marine chapters to accept. They view their Dreadnoughts as more than just weapons or equipment, see them as living connections to their history, as honored elders whose wisdom and experience must be preserved. The thought of one of their ancient brothers remaining in enemy hands, being desecrated and corrupted, being used as raw material for Ork war machines, is almost unbearable. Many chapters have standing orders that Dreadnought recovery takes absolute priority over all other concerns, that no cost is too high to ensure their ancient warriors receive proper honors. This commitment has led to some remarkable rescue operations. There are documented cases of Space Marine companies launching deep strikes into Ork-held territory specifically to recover Dreadnoughts, fighting through superior numbers and overwhelming opposition, suffering severe casualties, all to retrieve what amounts to a sarcophagus full of ancient components and dying flesh. To outside observers, these operations might seem like terrible tactical decisions, wasteful expenditures of precious resources for minimal gain. But to the Space Marines involved, they're matters of honor and duty that transcend strategic calculation. The Orks, for their part, don't really understand why the Humies get so worked up about these particular pieces of loot. To them, a Dreadnought is just another fighting machine, admittedly a really good one, but not fundamentally different from any other captured equipment. They'll fight to keep it because it's valuable and because fighting is fun, but they don't invest it with the same emotional significance that Space Marines do. If they lose it in battle, well, that's too bad. But there's always more loot to find elsewhere. This fundamental disconnect in how the two sides value Dreadnoughts creates situations that are simultaneously tragic and absurd. Space Marines will sacrifice everything to recover what they see as a fallen brother, while the Orks holding that brother are mostly just annoyed that someone wants to take their cool new toy away. It's the kind of culture clash that would be amusing if it weren't built on foundations of death and desecration. Looking at the broader pattern, what we see is a galaxy-wide scavenger hunt being played out across millennia, with Orks as the scavengers and the Imperium as the desperate collectors trying to reclaim what's been found. New discoveries happen regularly, some minor and some significant. Each one triggers its own chain of events. Ork excitement and modification, Imperial discovery and outrage, potential military response, possible recovery or permanent loss. The cycle repeats endlessly, as reliable as the march of time itself. And it's not just dreadnoughts, though they represent perhaps the most emotionally charged category of loot. Orks find and appropriate all manner of Imperial equipment, tanks, weapons, armor, even ships. Each discovery enriches the Ork warband that makes it, makes them more dangerous, draws more recruits to their banner. Each recovery operation depletes Imperial resources, costs lives, diverts forces from other critical missions. It's a war of attrition being fought on terms that favor the Orks, who don't care about losses and who will keep scavenging as long as there's anything left to find. Remember to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the lore of Warhammer 40,000, where we explore the stories behind the battles, the tragedies behind the heroes, and the endless conflicts that define the darkest timeline humanity has ever faced. Because if there's one thing the 40k universe teaches us, it's that no matter how bad you think things are, they can always get worse. And they probably will. And there's probably